Hey everybody, it's Ruby as always, and welcome to a new little series that I wanted to do. So this is going to be something kind of cool. We're going to be making our own plugin within GTA 5, and we're going to be able to basically do whatever we want within the game, and we're going to be able to code it and make that happen. The cool thing is that other than having to buy the game, which you don't need to actually write any code, everything's free. Visual Studio is free, FiveM is free, and obviously you writing the code is free. You know, if your time is yours. But so there's one thing, we're going to be using Visual Studio and we're going to be using C#. FiveM has multiple ways for you to develop a plugin. You could use Lua, or you could even use JavaScript, but the JavaScript I don't feel like is fleshed out that well, and I prefer a more strictly typed language like C#. And then also just the IDE of Visual Studio makes a lot of things easier, kind of takes a lot of the questions out of things, and you actually can kind of stay within the IDE for a lot of stuff, which is pretty useful. But like I said, you don't need GTA 5. You can actually download FiveM and get the libraries and then install Visual Studio, and you can code and kind of interact with the code as you want. It's just that whenever you'd actually want to test your code, you'd kind of be stuck without a way to do that. So anyways, other than Visual Studio and FiveM, you're also going to need some kind of text editor. So I have Visual Studio Code loaded here, but really anything would work, like Atom or even Notepad++. Just don't use the built-in Notepad editor. In Windows, it doesn't handle every file the best way, and it kind of forces some different kind of conventions for the file that we don't want always. So other than that, we kind of just need to get started. So I've gone ahead and installed Visual Studio. If you've already installed Visual Studio, you're going to install it. The most important thing to remember is that you install the .NET Desktop Development Workload package. So it'll ask you during install, or if you've already installed Visual Studio, you can open up Visual Studio Installer, and you can follow these steps that I'm doing right now and actually install it yourself. It's pretty straightforward. So now that we're back at our desktop, let's go ahead and create our new project. Once we're in here, we're looking for a certain type of file. We're going to want a class library of the .NET framework. So it's important that it's this exact one, because as you can see, there's quite a few different class libraries, but the one that we want is the class library .NET framework for C#. You'll see that this one's like Visual Basic and stuff. Those are the ones that you're not going to want. Then the first thing it's going to ask you for is your actual project name. So this is going to depend on what project you're working on first. So in our case, it's going to be the client one. The next location it asks you for is where you actually want to store the code. By default, it's just in your user folder. And then the solution name is actually going to be the name of our script. So for this first script, I think something that'll be, I don't know, I guess kind of easy for us to make first is kind of like a Bodyguard script. So let's go ahead and leave that there. And then for the framework, you're going to want to make sure you have 4.5.2 selected. This is just due to that's the only version that FiveM is currently supporting. And then you can go ahead and click Create, and it'll go ahead and set up the initial solution for you. So once you're loaded into Visual Studio and you have your project loaded, you'll be presented with this screen. For anybody who's new to Visual Studio, it's pretty easy. You've got this whole left side off over here. This is your code editor. And then once you actually build stuff, an additional box will pop up here at the bottom that will give you your build status. Over here off to the right is your actual solution. This is where all your different projects will be listed. There'll be a lot more information here as you build more advanced scripts. For example, whenever you have to make a server plugin as well, you'll have some extra options here as well. And then down here in the bottom right corner, this is where you'll actually interact with some options like the properties, for example, or different file properties, depending on which file you're looking at. So once we actually have this created, there's a couple things that we have to do to actually set our environment up to work with the CitizenFX, which is the FiveM API. So the first thing we need to actually do is set up a reference for the client library. So as you can see, we've got all kinds of different things here, but we're missing the CitizenFX one. So we'll right click, click Add Reference. It'll pop up in a new window like this, and we'll go ahead and click Browse. And by default, this will bring you to your repository folder. But up in the bar, you're going to want to type %, local, app data, %, and this is just a shortcut to your local app data folder where FiveM stores things. So here we can see FiveM, then the FiveM application data, Citizen, CLR2, lib mono 4.5, and then you're going to want to select citizenfx.core.dll. You'll notice that there's one called client. Don't get confused and click that one. That's actually not the library we need. You're going to want to make sure it's the citizenfx.core.dll, and it'll be around this size, or more or less, it depends. And we'll go ahead and click, well, actually we don't want to add it here. We can add it here, and it's not a problem, but sometimes if you, for example, want to send the solution to somebody else, instead of them having to depend on it being in the same spot, we'll actually copy this, and then we're going to want to go to our repos folder, which is in, by default, our users, admin, and then scroll down here to source, repos, then our solution name, then client, and you can go ahead and paste it in here, and then you can go ahead and double click it, and it'll add it into your resources. Click OK. Once that is added, you'll actually see citizenfx.core pop up over here. Once you have that open, you're going to want to go to its properties by just clicking on it, and then copy local. We're going to want to set this to false, because once we actually build our solution, we don't need Visual Studio to place this into our output directory. This will make a little bit more sense once we actually build our solution. So now that this is done, the next thing we can actually do is set up the class how we need it to be. So to do that, we need to set up the inheritance for it. So to do that, you're going to want to reference the class of base script. And then Visual Studio gives you these nice red squiggly lines, which just basically means an error. And you can show potential fixes. And you can use this directive using citizenfx.core, which will then resolve this issue. So you'll notice that these are all grayed out. Visual Studio will gray those out when they're not needed or they're not being used. So we can go ahead and remove those for now because we don't actually need them right now. So now that we've got our initial inheritance set up, there's a few more things that we need to do. The first thing we want to do is actually rename this from class 1. So that is just because we want to rename it to main. It makes a little bit more sense, and it's a lot easier. The next thing that'll pop up is a option of project rename. So this will actually do a full rename of anywhere that the main file is referenced. So for example, in this text. So we'll click yes, and it'll automatically do a find and replace for us. So now that this is done, there's one more thing we have to do for the actual properties. So we'll go ahead and double click properties, and then we'll come up here, and then for our assembly name, we want to add .net to the end. That is a FiveM requirement. Then we want to go to build, and we want to change this output to, let's say, /output. So this will put the built library up one directory and into the output folder. This is not so useful right now, but it's a little bit more organized, and whenever we actually make multiple projects, like a server script as well, it'll put them all into the same location, so it's a little easier to work with. Click Advanced, and then debugging information we want to change to embedded. That'll give you a little bit more information. And then you can go ahead and save it, and we can come back to our main file. So once we're in here, we can go ahead and create our public main. So this is just our actual first function that's going to get run as soon as this class is initiated. So in here you can do all kinds of things. You can register commands, event handlers, set up configuration values, things like that. But the thing that we really need to do is, for this first one, is maybe just register a command. It's the easiest way of kind of testing your code, and it's something that you only need one client for, so you don't have to set up a server set up to trigger a command or anything like that. So once we have the base script inheritance set up, we can start to use some of the different stuff built into CitizenFX. One of those things is the API. So we do need to set up an extra use statement for this first. So we'll go ahead and do show potential fixes, and using citizenfx.core.native, we'll go ahead and do that. And then the function is named, probably as you would expect, register command. So if we look at the parameters that this one wants, it wants a string of command name, and then input argument and restricted. So the command name, let's just set it up as, let's say test. So this will be so when we type /test in the game, this option will get ran. For the input argument, we can just pass it a new action of test command. And then for restricted, let's just set that to false for now. It's fine. So once again, we have another error. And for action, we need to set up the using system option. And then test command, well, that just doesn't exist yet because this is the command that we need to make. So down here below, we'll go ahead and create a private static void of test command, and basically this means that this element, this method is only available to our actual bodyguard script, and then it's a void because it doesn't actually return anything. So in here we can actually start to write some of our code. So one of the things to remember about script development is most of the time it's always going to revolve around your own player. So to start with, we need to figure out who our player is, like our actual player within the game. So within CitizenFX, all things get stored into classes, much like much code does. So one of the classes we have available to us is called the PED, and any NPC or player character within the game is going to be of the type PED. It's a bit different than, say, an entity or an object or a prop, and they have some extra options available to them. So, and the next thing we need to actually set up is the variable name. So this will be us, so we'll just name it player. So much like API and other things, you also have the game variable accessible to you. So within here, there's a few things that are kind of useful, like game timing and stuff like that. But the most important thing, as you can see here, is going to be the player variable. So if you look at here, you can see that this is actually a type of player. So that's actually not the value we want. If we go one deeper and we go to the value of character, we can see that that is a PED. So this is the actual value that we're going to want for this. Once this is done, we know who our player is. So this is useful so that when we spawn our bodyguard, we can spawn him relative to our location. We don't spawn him across the map and we need to go drive to him, or he needs to run to us or something silly like that. So let's go ahead and set up our bodyguard. So much like our player, he's going to be a pet as well because he's an NPC. And let's name him bodyguard just so we know who's who. And then this is going to be equal to a function value because we need to actually make this guy. He doesn't exist yet. We're going to have to make him appear. So much like game, we also have world accessible to us, and this has all kinds of fun functions into like creating vehicles, drawing lines, getting vehicles. But one thing we have accessible to us is create PED. So if we take a look at create PED's parameters, it takes a few ones. So the first thing it wants is a model. So you have a few options of passing a model to create PED. You can do it in the string notation. Like if I wanted to spawn a paramedic, I would do something like this. But sometimes these can be kind of hard to find, and they're kind of hard to remember. So one thing that FiveM gives to us is something called a PED hash. So if we look within this enum, you can see there's all kinds of different values. And you can probably guess what like a dolphin is, or a doctor. But some of these are kind of confusing, like East SA and stuff like that. They can be a little confusing. So there's one thing you can reference, and that is the actual PED database. So I've got the page loaded over here, and as you can see, they've actually got a screenshot of every single pedestrian model within the game. So there's all kinds of different ones, and this list is pretty long. I could scroll for a while. So with the bodyguard, let's just try to find some kind of security guy. Oh, that actually works for me. So this Chemset guy looks like he's got like some body armor on. So I don't know, I think he fits the bill. Let's go ahead and go back to Visual Studio. So once we're here, we can actually add that value for the name that it gave us right here. And that's all you really have to do. A little easier to remember, and then also it looks a lot better in the code using PED hashes rather than strings. The next parameter it wants is a vector 3. So a vector 3 is an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate. So that's wherever you are on the map, and then whatever your height is. So it could be 0 or 100 or 200. It really depends wherever your player is on the map. So for this, since we already know who our player is, we can spawn him relative to our player. So what we can do is we can use the player.position value, and that is a vector 3 of the player's current X, Y, and Z coordinate. So while we could spawn him right on top of us, it would be kind of awkward, right? So one thing that we can do, and that the like different entities and PEDs have accessible to them, is a special value called a forward vector, an up vector, and then a right vector. So if we reference player position and then we do addition, we add some parentheses. Let's do player dot forward vector, and then we'll do times 2. That'll put him a few steps in front of us and not right on top of us, so that we don't have any kind of spawn issue. So we get another error because if you take a look closely at the return type of this function, you'll see that it returns a type of task ped, not a ped. So basically what that means is that this command we need to await. And in order to actually use the await keyword, we have to convert our function to an asynchronous task, which is that easy. Sometimes this will cause you some issues depending on if you're using like reference variables, but there's a lot of different ways around some stuff, so it kind of depends on what your case is. So now that we have this guy loaded, we're missing one vital step when it comes to actually spawning models within the game. The game requires you to load animations and models into memory before you can actually use them. While depending on how this works, for example, if I ran this command now, the first time I would run it, it would actually not work. If I ran it a second time, it would work, and it would be a little confusing. So the issue with that is because the first time the game loads the model, but then it can't do anything because the function doesn't finish in time. And then once we load it the second time, it's already loaded into memory and the command will most likely work as you intended. So much like world.createPed or api.register command, there's a command called api.requestModel. And this is going to take a uint of a model. So we need to typecast it to uint by doing parentheses uint, and then we can reference our same ped hash as before. So the chemsec01 guy here. And then go ahead and end that line. And one thing we want to do is that while this will go ahead and request it, we're still immediately jumping into code logic right after. So what we want to do is actually interrupt the logic. So we'll use a while loop, and much like request model, we have a function called has model loaded. And like before, we're going to need to take it as a uint of ped hash and then chemsec001, and then we'll finish this out. But if you look closely at this logic, it's actually the opposite way that we need it. So while this has loaded, it will do whatever is inside of here. So to do that, we'll just add an exclamation mark to flip the statement. And then within here, we can go ahead and use a delay script built into base script to actually sleep this process for 1/10 of a second. Because 100, that's not 100 seconds, that's actually 100 milliseconds. So basically, to go back over it, we're going to request the model. Then while the model has not loaded, we're going to wait 1/10 of a second. And then once it has loaded, it will continue with the rest of the logic and work as intended. So one thing we can do is we can add some debug here. So let's say waiting for model to load. And that way, whenever we press F8 in the game, we can actually see a message of how long it took to load. And then if you, for some reason, specify an incorrect model, like one that doesn't exist, this would loop infinitely. So it'd be kind of important to make sure you double check your models. And then once you actually test your script to see if you maybe had a spelling mistake or something else like that. So now that we have the model loaded, we have our guy created, we can actually start to interact with him. So by default, whenever you create this pedestrian, if you notice down at the end, there's an optional option of heading. So it will default to 0, which is just a random direction, and depending on which way your actual player is facing. So what you want to do is maybe get him to look at you. So if we look at the bodyguard variable, there's all kinds of different things we have accessible to us. You know, there's a lot of like Boolean values, like are they an enemy, are they driving, are they climbing, are they being carjacked, stuff like that. But one thing we have available to us are the task methods. So if you look at in here, there's all kinds of fun stuff like fleeing from people, shooting at people, you know, going to people. So one that we have obviously have available is look at. So the parameter this one is looking for is actual an entity. So while you may think we need a type of entity, actually this will work for our pedestrian as well. So we want him to look at our player. And the other parameter that it wanted was optional, so we don't have to worry about that one right now. So as our code stands right now, he'll spawn in and he'll look at us, but we haven't actually given him anything to do, which is kind of the big deal. So the next thing we want to do is set him as our group member. So what that does in the code is actually sets him as part of our quote-unquote group in the game, and he'll follow us around, and then he'll also be our companion. So if anybody attacks us, they'll attack them, and vice versa. So once again, we'll reference API, and then we're going to want to use the function set ped as group member. And the first parameter it looks for is int ped, which may sound kind of confusing because a ped is a ped. It's not an integer. But what this function is actually looking for is the network ID handle of that pedestrian. So since we want to set our bodyguard as the member, we'll reference him here, and then we'll use the variable handle attached to him, and that is the value that it's looking for, is the actual network ID. The next thing it wants to know is the group ID that we want to add this bodyguard to. So I don't know offhand what the group is, and you don't ever want to really hard code these kind of things. So once again, there's another function that we can use. This one is called getPedGroupIndex, and this one is going to want our player's network handle, as you can see, an int of ped. So we'll reference player.handle here, and then go ahead and end that function. So that's all good right now, but we're still missing a couple things. For one, he's unarmed, he doesn't have any weapons, and then two, he has whatever his default combat ability is. So depending on the ped, it could be different. So let's go ahead and set his combat ability. And we'll go ahead and once again we're looking for an int of ped, so we'll pass the bodyguard's handle. But then there's this weird int p1 parameter that it's looking for. Not very informative, not very helpful. So this is where the runtime documentation for FiveM comes in great help. So what we can actually do is copy this function. We can come over to the runtime navigation, or runtime reference, I'm sorry, and then we can paste this function in here, and it will pull it up in their actual documentation. So it depends on the function, honestly, how like popular of a function it is. Some of these don't have documentation, some do. So, but if we look here, someone figured out in the game code, once they decrypted it, that 0 would make them a poor friend, 1 would be average, and 2 would be professional. So basically this is how good of a shot they are. So I don't know, let's go with professional because, you know, hey, I'd kind of like my guys to be a professional. So we'll come back to Visual Studio, we'll drop a 2 on the end, and then that is that. So the last thing that we're missing is to give him a weapon. So as you can probably guess what this function is called, give weapon to ped. And the first thing it wants again is his handle. Then the next thing it wants is a weapon hash of uint. So much like ped hash, we have weapon hash available to us. And let's give him, I don't know, let's say this assault rifle or something like that. I think that'll work pretty good. Then the next thing we need is the ammo count. We'll give him 500 bullets. Is hidden to false, and then equip now to true. So that way he'll go ahead and equip the weapon. So as it stands right now, we're actually good. He would appear in the game, follow us around, and be our friend, but he doesn't ever really say anything. So one thing we can do is use play ambient speech, and you can use the generic hi. So if you look at this, it asks for the speech name. Is that if I could keep it up on the screen, sorry. Within the game, they all have different kinds of speeches built into their models. So every character has a generic hi. Almost every character has like a generic bye or a generic thanks, stuff like that. I'll leave the speech information down in the description, along with links to the runtime documentation, the ped links, stuff like that, so you can kind of get to them easily. So now that we have this done, we can go ahead and save our code, and we're kind of ready to go ahead and install our script onto our server. The next thing you're going to need is you're going to load one more file into your solution. For FiveM to register your plugin for the server, you need what's called a resource.lua file. So I've actually already got one of these prepared on my desktop. So here I'm going to go ahead and go to Client, right click, Add Existing Item, and then much like the CitizenFX core, I'm going to copy this into our repository folder. So I have this on our desktop, and we'll switch it to all types or all files, and we're going to copy this file, and then we're going to go back to our Bodyguard folder, and then you can actually drop it in the root folder here, because both your server and your client will use the same resource.lua file. So we'll go ahead and add it in here, and then we want to click on this file, and then copy to output directory we actually want to change to copy always. This way it'll always put it into our build directory. So now that we have this done, you can close that, and make sure everything is saved, make sure your client is saved, and you filled out all the information that we did earlier, and then you're actually ready to go ahead and build this script for the first time. So let's go ahead and do build solution. You'll see the build status window pop down here at the bottom left, and this will tell you any errors that you run across, any mistakes that you might have made, like maybe an unused variable, or if you didn't use, like, say, an asynchronous task correctly, it would let you know here. But hey, we're pretty lucky. Build 1 succeeded, so we know it's successfully built. So depending on wherever you pointed your actual output directory, so for example ours was /output, we'll come back to our project, and if you left it default, it's users, your user, then source, repos, then your solution name, and then here we see the output directory here. And we have these 2 files created. So these are the files that you actually need to load onto your server. If you've never actually made a FiveM server, it's pretty straightforward. One of the things that you'll need, of course, is all of these server files. So let's go ahead and load those now. Alright, so I've got the documentation loaded up here. And as soon as you start, you obviously want to follow their instructions, install the redistributable. And then the first thing you want to do is go ahead and install the artifacts. And then you need to go ahead and open up this server data repository. So if you come to artifacts, there's going to be a long list, and really the key is you just want to grab the latest one. If you run into any kind of weird issue or things don't work, maybe try to go back a version. There could be some kind of issue with that build. So you want to go ahead and download this. Once you have it downloaded, we're going to need to extract it to a new folder. So we'll go ahead and open it up, and we'll extract to, and you want to leave this in a location where it's kind of easy to get to. So we'll create a new FX server folder in our C drive, and we'll extract everything there. So we'll go back to our web browser, and you're going to want to go ahead and download the CFX server data. You can click clone or download, and then download zip. It'll download it, and then what this is going to do is give you the resources that you need for the server. So within that main folder is a resources folder. If we come back and let's go ahead and open up a new folder. We'll leave that one open up to our output directory. And then we'll go to C FX server where we installed our server, and we're going to drag this resources folder into here. Then go ahead and go into the resources folder, and let's go ahead and make our plugin folder here. So we'll name this the same as our solution, Bodyguard. And then if we come back to this output directory, we can go ahead and copy and paste these files into here. Alright, so now that we've got everything extracted and we've got our Bodyguard script created, you can go ahead and come back to the root folder of FX server, and we need to actually create our server configuration file now. So we can just create a new text document, and we'll name this server.cfg, and then go ahead and open this up in your text editor. I'm going to open it up with Visual Studio Code. Then if we come back to the starting or setting up a server page, if you scroll all the way down, they actually give you a sample configuration. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it into this new file we just created. And if we scroll up here, you're going to see all of these resources will start by default. So we'll go ahead and start our Bodyguard script. This is going to be whatever you name the folder within the resources folder. The next thing you want to do is change this to EN, US, or whatever is appropriate for your area. You can set your server host name here, like let's say Ruby's dev server. And then the next important thing you have to do is set up the Steam Web API key and then your actual FiveM license key. So they give you the URLs to do that here, and this is required, or else you might run into like some authentication issues, and then the server just won't let you launch if you don't have a license key. It's required. Alright, so I've gone ahead and filled out my API keys. So we're done now. We can go ahead and close Visual Studio Code, and we can go ahead and open up the FX server folder once again. And the next thing we actually need to do is run our server. So to do that, you can just make sure you don't have any files selected in the folder, and hold down Shift and right click off to the side. Whoop, not that high though. Right click off to the side, and you'll get a Open PowerShell window here, or Command Terminal window. If you don't have that option, you can always just go to Start and then actually open up the Command Terminal here, and then type the command CD and then space wherever you actually installed your server. So for us, that would be C FX server. for us. So now that we're here and we're actually in the correct directory, we can go ahead and run the actual server. So to do that, the command is /run.cmd +exec space /server.cfg. Everything's got a space between it. So once you run this, it's going to actually start the server and run your configuration file. So the important thing to pay attention to here is that there's no errors. So if we scroll back up to the top, we can see that it loaded our resource just fine, and we don't really see any errors. So that's good news. So the next thing we can do is go ahead and load into FiveM and GTA 5 and actually test our code. Alright, so we're actually loaded in the game now. So we can go ahead and press T and do /test, and we can see that our command is loading. So if we go ahead and do /test, oh, and he appears and he said hi to us. So that's cool. Let's go ahead and see if he follows us. That would mean he's a part of our group and all that good stuff. He's just kind of awkwardly, okay, now he's coming. You had to think about it for a second. But let's maybe antagonize this guard, and that'll kind of test whether or not everything's working right. So we might just be able to punch him and get away with it. We'll see. Oh, yep. Well, we killed him. I didn't mean to do that. But this guy's not very happy. So, oh, and you can see he's actually going to pop out his... Oh, don't shoot us, though. Oh, Jesus. He should fight that cop for us, though. Yep. And obviously this would work with, like, gang members and stuff like that, too. Although I would probably suggest against it. Oh, no, let's get another guy. Help us, please. Oh no, the other guy died. Let's get another one. So as you can see, you can obviously make as many as you want. It doesn't matter because obviously we're creating a new pedestrian every time. So other than our cop problem, we're kind of all good to go here. But I think this is a really good stopping point for this episode, and I want to call that good for today. I'd really love to hear from you guys about your questions or comments, or maybe what you guys want to make in this series, because the world is almost endless with possibilities. Oh no. I don't feel bad for those cops, but really it's down to whatever you want to do. I've made a lot of cool plugins so far, so it's really what everybody wants. But I'm gonna go ahead and end that here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.